The way the world looks is something we often take for granted. It's typically until something defies our expectations that we take notice. For instance, what makes a thing look old? What makes a place look old? Think about it. When you interact with something, in addition to its size, color, texture, and other aspects, you also have a sense of that thing's age. Game developers need to ask themselves this question, because when building a game world, they have to create everything from scratch. And they don't just have to worry about how old something looks, but how old it sounds, how old it feels. Also, video games in general have only been around for about 50 years. So how do they make something feel old in an art form so new? Game developers communicate the age of their world in a lot of ways. Too many to talk about all of them. But I've organized a lot of the signs of aging into 8 major categories. We'll talk about each of them in chronological order. Before that, an important aspect of age that doesn't quite fit into my categories is scale. After capturing footage from so many games, I've realized that structures being bigger makes them feel older. I think this is because of our modern association with size. Since the era of microcomputing began in the 60s, a lot of technological advancement has been about making things smaller. Computers have gotten smaller, medicine has gotten smaller. In the past, being able to build things larger than ever before was a mark of cutting-edge technology. But today, largeness is a mark of antiquity. So throughout the video, take notice of that scale and how it affects your perception of age. Okay, our first category is construction. Before a thing is new, it is what you might call pre-new. It is in the process of being created, and showing that process is a good way to set a starting line for everything else in the world in terms of age. Now, game designers don't show things organically being built. That would be too complex. But they can show some evidence. Things like scaffolding on half-built structures, or piles of raw materials set aside for later use, or workers moving things around in a facsimile of construction can give the impression that things are being built. And you can then imagine what that construction site might become. Sometimes it can be art being built, like statues being carved, or pottery being painted. In Red Dead Redemption 2, they go the extra mile and show this building being put together early in the game. And if you visit the site at later points in the story, you can see progress being made. Audio is important too. You typically hear construction before you see it. Nails being hammered, shouting of instructions and directions, power tools, and trucks idling or backing up. The sound of construction is as iconic as it is disruptive. Other details like blueprints can give a sense of a world in conception. You won't get to see the finished product, but details like this tell us someone is planning something. Much of real life consists of making plans, and so when I see plans in a game, it adds a little bit of life to the digital space. I also enjoy when there are billboards aspirationally depicting the finished product of the construction. In real life, you will see frequently these large posters around building sites displaying what is intended to be there. Showing these pre-new spaces gives the player something to compare the rest of the world to. Everything is older than a thing still in production. So, with the age scale zeroed out, the designers can go on to distinguish the new from the old. The next category is what I'll call wear. For our purposes, wear is when a thing shows evidence of being in use. Its form might change, but its function remains intact. Almost instantly, a new thing is touched by the elements and starts to become worn. subtly at first, but it doesn't take long for the signs of wear to become visible. For example, a discoloration on fabric, chipped wall paint, slight rusting or denting on a vehicle. A scuffed boot or a depressed cushion can tell the comforting story of mundane activity. These things look different and/or worse over time, but they can still be used for their intended purpose. One of my favorite examples are these metal statues that have their noses polished by all the hands that touch them as they pass by. This polishing is also something you see in real life, as the oils and friction of many hands over time will wear away the oxidized surface of bronze or copper. These statues look a little different, but no one would say that they're broken. Death Stranding is the only game I know of where the vehicles and equipment progressively rust over time. So if you find a truck, you have a pretty good idea of how long it's been out in the elements. And if it stays out too long, it becomes junk. Which leads us to our next category, tear. Wear and tear are different in that wear can change the form of the thing while the function remains intact, but tear compromises both the form and the function. It's the difference between a stained shirt and a ripped shirt. Both of these categories are important because they not only show that a thing has been used, but also how a thing has been used, or in this case, abused. Broken architecture can say a lot about the state of the game world. A broken or burned wood structure might imply accident or negligence, while broken stonework or concrete can imply violence and war. Shattered glass and pottery are frequent in video games. I understand why, it's a very evocative imagery. You can probably already hear the sound these things made when they broke. While a worn place can feel lived in and lively because of that wear, a torn place can feel dangerous and deathly. Because so many games take place in a post-apocalypse, tear is one of the most common types of aging you'll see. And a torn world gives the opportunity for repair. Repair would be any visible attempt to restore the functionality of something torn. In the same category would be a refurbish, which seeks to extend the functionality of something worn. They can be small repairs, like patches on clothing. They can be medium repairs, like filled potholes in the road. They can be large repairs, like external load-bearing pillars holding a house up, or reinforcing an old building with new metalwork. The sound of repair can be confused with the sound of construction, but there is a difference. Repair typically involves some level of demolition. Damaged sections need to be removed or destroyed to make a suitable surface for the new additions, and you can hear this process. Think of the sound of prying a nail out of wood, or ripping away rotten wood, or scraping off a rusted surface. Familiar sounds of effort that you don't hear when something is being constructed. This kind of effort can speak about the people of the game world, their economic status or their priorities. If they were rich enough, they would just replace these things. And if they were too poor, they couldn't afford the repairs. Or maybe they value reuse. Or just have a sentimental connection to something and want to keep it around. Either way, things like a patched hole in the wall or a car mechanic shop denote a certain level of care from the residents of a place, or at least a level of use and reuse. These details tell you that people live here and want to make the best of it, or have to make the best of it in spite of their circumstances. But what happens when people can no longer make the best of something? Well, you get the next category. All the categories we've talked about so far have been about how a thing or a place is used. Abandonment, in contrast, is about the lack of use. It doesn't have to be total abandonment. The signs can start out as a subtle neglect. Dust buildup and cobwebs. Bigger signs would be long-term power outages. And eventually you get to the most obvious sign, emptiness. When you see a place that people used to occupy, but is now empty, you get a strong sense of the time that has elapsed. Because we intuitively know that for a place to be abandoned, it first had to be built, lived in, broken, and possibly repaired. Those stages can all be communicated just by a lack of activity. For that reason, abandoned places are common in video games. Designers can inject a lot of history and storytelling and implied drama while not actually having to fill the game world with people and dialogue and animations, which are all very costly additions. Despite the cost-effectiveness of abandoned places, they can be very evocative, especially if we have a strong sensory association with those places. Like a playground, typically noisy with children, or a restaurant, typically full of aroma and activity. The absence of people can be eerie and somber, so it does a good job of communicating emotion as well as age. I'm not surprised it's used so often. You might think the sound of abandonment is characterized by a lack of audio, but in reality there are little noises that help communicate the quiet of an abandoned place. Being able to hear sounds like a small breeze, or the subtle rustle of grass, or an echo of your own footsteps accentuates the quietude in a way actual silence does not. Whatever space humans make for themselves is borrowed. When we abandon those spaces, the bill comes due. And the payment is what I'm calling reclamation. It comes soon after abandonment and is characterized by various aspects of the natural world reclaiming the human world. Vines climbing up brick walls, a bedding of moss in darker areas, grass breaking through the road. These three are visually the most common type that designers will use. I think because of their artistic versatility. You can add vines and moss and grass to just about any existing structure. Trees require a little more work. They need plenty of room and sunlight, so the existing structures need to be more significantly altered to allow for them. A broken roof or a crumbled wall, that sort of thing. A tree is an effective tool to show the age of a place because their size directly corresponds to their age. If you walk into an abandoned structure and not only is there a tree, but a big tree, you know at just a glance that this place has been abandoned for decades. Greenery is just one way a place can be reclaimed. The ocean can swallow up a coastline and all the civilization with it. Instead of moss and grass and vines, you get algae and barnacles and seaweed. These ecosystems take time to develop, and artists use natural ecosystems like this to mark that time. Underwater ecosystems have the benefit of being more colorful and otherworldly, providing a visual contrast to the gray human world of steel and concrete. Both above and below the water, animals will also be part of the reclamation. Seeing a deer or a coral reef doesn't directly make us think old, but putting those animals in places where they shouldn't be does set off our sense of time. Animals are skittish and wary, especially of humans. And so if a family of giraffes is wandering calmly along a highway, you can imagine how long that highway had to be empty for them to feel that comfortable. Human places can also be reclaimed by non-living things, like when they're buried in sand. They could have been the most advanced and ornate buildings, but to the shifting dunes, they might as well be just another boulder in the way. Seeing a reclaimed environment like this, we can tell it is very old. With the next category, we move on to what makes a place look not just old, but ancient. I'm going to loosely call this one erosion. Erosion is the geological process in which earthen materials are worn away and transported by natural forces such as wind or water. Technically, erosion happens at every stage we've talked about so far, but it's such a slow process that we don't notice it while it's happening. We notice erosion only after a long time has passed, so naturally we associate it with the passing of a long time. And while we may have an association, we don't have an understanding, because we're dipping into timescales so large, humans can barely comprehend them. So far, we've talked about processes that span dozens or hundreds of years. Major erosion happens over thousands of years, and by forces that defy understanding for lack of intent. Generally speaking, things are constructed or repaired or abandoned or reclaimed because there was an intention by a living thing to do so. But the world is eroded by forces older than life itself. Depicting the process of erosion in a video game is difficult. The developer would need to create their world and then fully simulate the geological forces breaking down that world over time. Developers can't really do this. But some of the more ambitious and well-funded developers do run water and wind simulations in the research phase to get a better understanding of how they can fake the look of erosion. There are some subtly authentic ground features in The Witcher 3, like here where you can see how some past movement of water ate away at the dirt and left an overhanging of soil and grass, with the grass roots binding the topsoil together well enough to resist the pull of water and gravity. A detail from Horizon Forbidden West is how the sea level changes the look of these sunken buildings. The concrete at the base of the buildings has been scrubbed away by the sea salt, leaving the central structure exposed and the concrete on the upper half of the building intact. The top-heavy look this creates is striking, especially when combined with the vegetation that has reclaimed the remaining upper floors. Details like this are one of the more difficult aspects of age to get right in a video game. The developer needs a basic understanding of earth science to create a world believably altered by thousands of years of granular changes. Erosion is a kind of anti-life. It constantly negates everything life is trying to create. When we say dust to dust, this is what we mean. Everything we build and use will eventually become dust because of erosion. I think that's why erosion is one of my favorite categories of aging. The once sharp edges of a polished stone become rough and rounded by the assault of countless grains of sand propelled by endless wind. Exquisite glasswork becomes soft and frosted by a constant massage of water. It reminds me that I'm watching the process of something become nothing. I'm not seeing a thing or a place be claimed by humans or reclaimed by nature. I'm watching it become unclaimed. I find comfort in that. With enough time, an eroded place may be found again, and the whole process can repeat itself. This gives the artistic opportunity for the developer to layer civilizations on top of each other. The new built on the bones of the old, and the old peeking through the flesh of the new. This layering effect is hard to visually communicate because the result can look too busy and messy. But if it's done well, It can tell the story of 10,000 years in a single image, creating a conversation between civilizations separated by oceans of time. A game won't trick you into thinking you're actually standing in revolutionary France or post-apocalyptic America, but the details of aging can trick you into thinking about the passage of time and your place in it. A game can immerse you in a place that feels like it's full of history and nuance. And for the games that do it best, those details are almost invisible, seamlessly fitting into your visual intuition, transporting you to a world that looks and sounds far older than it has any right to.